In early February 1945, General Alfred Schlemm had a problem. His first Fallschirmjäger army held a 12-kilometer stretch of the Siegfried Line between the Rhine and the Maas rivers. The Reichswald forest, dense, wet, crisscrossed with pre-cut firing lanes, was his killing ground. His divisions were under strength, ammunition was rationed, fuel was scarce. But Schlemm had read the intelligence summaries. The 1st Canadian Army was coming, and the summaries said the Canadians would fold. Not immediately. German intelligence wasn't stupid. They knew the Canadians had fought through Normandy, the Scheldt, the Rhineland. But the assessments compiled from interrogations, captured orders, and observation suggested a pattern. The Canadians were methodical, cautious. They relied on artillery. When casualties mounted, they slowed down. When faced with dug-in Fallschirmjäger, they called for air support and waited. The summaries used the word "sogenannte hesitant." Schlemm believed it. So did his division commanders. The 84th Infantry Division, holding the Reichswald southern edge, had orders to delay for 72 hours minimum. The 7th Fallschirmjäger Division, dug into bunkers along the Matterborn feature, was told to hold indefinitely. The logic was simple: inflict casualties, make them stop, force them to regroup. Buy time for the Rhine bridges to be prepared for demolition. The terrain favored defense. The Reichswald was not a natural forest. It had been managed for centuries, straight lanes cut for timber extraction, fields of fire cleared for hunting. The Germans turned those lanes into kill zones. Every crossroads was mined. Every clearing had interlocking machine gun positions. The bunkers were reinforced concrete, built into the Siegfried Line's outer belt. Some had been there since 1938. The walls were 2 meters thick. The ground was worse. February rains had turned the soil into paste. Tracked vehicles sank. Wheeled vehicles didn't move at all. The few paved roads were cratered by German engineers before they withdrew. The only routes forward were forest tracks, single lane, unimproved, and covered by German artillery observers on the Matterborn heights. Schlemm's intelligence staff calculated that the 1st Canadian Army would need 4 days to concentrate enough ammunition for a sustained assault. Then another 2 days to move it forward through the mud. Then the assault itself, assuming the Canadians committed 2 divisions, would stall within 72 hours once casualties exceeded 10%. Standard Commonwealth doctrine, according to the summaries, called for operational pauses when rifle companies dropped below 60% strength. The math said the Germans had time. The Canadians arrived on February 8, 1945, at 0500 hours. They did not hesitate. The opening barrage involved 1,050 guns. Not an exaggeration. The Royal Canadian Artillery, British XXX Corps Artillery, medium regiments, heavy regiments, plus attached British Army Group's Royal Artillery units. They fired on a front 8 kilometers wide. The bombardment lasted 5.5 hours. It targeted German observation posts, command bunkers, communication trenches, supply routes, and pre-registered defensive positions. Counter-battery radar located German guns. Those guns were hit within minutes. This was not random shelling. The fire plan designated Operation Veritable Fire Plan No. 1 had been rehearsed for 3 weeks. Every battery knew its target sequence. Forward observation officers were embedded with lead infantry companies. Predicted fire, not observed fire, meaning the guns fired on coordinates without waiting for spotters to call corrections. The math had been done in advance. The ammunition expenditure for February 8 alone was 93,000 rounds. That's more than some entire divisions fired in a month during the Italian campaign. The supply chain required to deliver that tonnage across flooded roads, through bottlenecks, under German counter-battery fire had been built over 6 weeks. Canadian Army Service Corps convoys ran 24-hour schedules. Dumps were positioned 5 kilometers behind the start line. Each dump held 3 days of ammunition. The Germans assumed this was impossible. It wasn't. At 10:30 hours, the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division and 3rd Canadian Infantry Division crossed the start line. The 2nd Division aimed for the Reichswald's western edge and the town of Weiler. The 3rd Division drove toward Cranenburg and the Matterborn Spur. Behind them, the 15th Scottish Division moved through the British sector. The Germans opened fire. The Fallschirmjäger were not broken. The bunkers along the Siegfried Line were intact. MG-42 machine guns covered the approach roads. Pre-sighted mortar concentrations landed on the Canadian assembly areas. Panzerfaust teams waited in tree lines. The German 84th Division's after-action log notes: enemy infantry advancing in company strength, supported by tanks, under heavy artillery cover. The Canadians did not stop. They did not call for air support and wait. They moved. Here's what the German reports missed. The Canadian infantry-tank teams had trained together for months. Each rifle company had a troop of tanks attached, usually Shermans from the Fort Garry Horse or the Sherbrooke Fusiliers. The infantry did not follow the tanks. They moved alongside them. When a bunker opened fire, the infantry marked it with colored smoke. The tank fired high explosive at the bunker's firing slit. The infantry closed with Wasp flamethrowers or grenades. Average time from contact to bunker neutralization, 11 minutes. The doctrine had been written after the Scheldt fighting in October 1944. Canadian units had learned that infantry attacking bunkers alone took too many casualties. Tanks attacking without infantry support got hit by Panzerfausts. But combined with infantry suppressing anti-tank teams and tanks suppressing bunkers, the system worked. The training took place in Belgium during January 1945. Mock bunkers were built. Live fire exercises ran daily. By the time the 2nd and 3rd Divisions reached the Reichswald, the platoon commanders knew the drill by reflex. The Germans expected the Canadians to dig in after the first defensive line. They did not. The 2nd Division's war diary for February 8 records continuous movement until 1800 hours. 12 hours of contact. The division advanced 4 kilometers, not much by open ground standards, but through minefields, bunkers, and forest. Casualties were heavy. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry lost 63 men in the first 6 hours, but the advance did not stop. The German assumption was that casualties would force a pause. Canadian doctrine said otherwise. Rifle companies rotated. When the lead company hit 60% strength, the reserve company passed through and continued the advance. The battered company withdrew, reorganized, received replacements from reinforcement units, and moved back into reserve. The system kept pressure constant. By February 10, the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division had reached the Matterhorn Spur. This was a low ridge, fortified with interconnected bunkers and trench systems. The 7th Fallschirmjäger Division held it. Their commander, General Major Erdmann, expected the Canadians to pause for resupply. The logistics were obvious. The roads into the Reichswald were narrow, flooded, and under German artillery fire. Moving ammunition forward required corduroy roads logs laid across mud. Building those roads took time. Erdmann assumed the Canadians would wait. The Royal Canadian Engineers built the roads under fire. The 6th Field Company, 18th Field Company, and 7th Field Company worked in shifts. They cut trees, dragged logs, laid corduroy over the mud, and installed culverts, while German 105mm guns fired at pre-registered coordinates. The engineers took casualties. The 6th Field Company lost 16 men in 2 days. But the road stayed open. Ammunition trucks moved forward. The artillery kept firing. One engineering report describes the process in detail. Logs had to be at least 20 centimeters in diameter to support a loaded truck. The engineers cut them with 2-man saws. Chainsaws were in short supply. Each log was dragged by hand or by a universal carrier to the road site, laid crosswise, nailed down with spikes. Then the next log. A 100-meter stretch of corduroy road required 400 logs. Building it took 6 hours under ideal conditions. Under fire, with rain, in the dark 12 hours. The German assumption that logistics would force a pause was wrong. On February 11, the Canadians used a tactic the Germans did not expect. Instead of a frontal assault on Matterhorn, the 3rd Division looped south and east, using the forest for cover. Lead elements, Winnipeg Rifles, and Canadian-Scottish Regiment infiltrated through uncleared German positions at night. They did not engage. They moved past German strongpoints, reached the ridge's rear slopes, and called artillery onto the bunkers from behind. This was not a heroic charge. It was reconnaissance in force. Small patrols, 10 to 12 men, moved quietly through gaps in the German line. When they found an undefended route, they radioed coordinates. Follow-on companies used those routes. The Germans did not detect the movement until Canadian infantry appeared behind their positions. The 7th Fallschirmjäger Division's radio logs show confusion. Fire was coming from unexpected directions. Canadian infantry appeared in sectors that should have been impassable. The logs use the word durchgebrochen, broken through. But it wasn't a breakthrough. It was infiltration. The Canadians had moved through gaps the Germans thought were covered by interlocking fire. Those gaps existed because the Fallschirmjäger were under strength. They couldn't man every position. The Canadians found the gaps. By February 13, Matterborn was in Canadian hands. German casualties for the 7th Fallschirmjäger Division were estimated at 800 men. Canadian casualties for the 3rd Division were 542. The ratio was not in Germany's favor. Schlemm's intelligence summaries had predicted the Canadians would take unsustainable losses and pull back. They had not. The weather got worse. The Roer River, upstream, had been dammed by the Germans. When Allied engineers blew the dams on February 10, the floodwaters spread across the Rhineland plain. The roads into the Reichswald turned into canals. Tanks bogged down. Supply trucks sank to their axles. The Germans assumed this would stop the Canadians. It did not. The Royal Canadian Army Service Corps switched to amphibious vehicles, weasels, and DUKWs. Ammunition arrived by water. The engineers built pontoon causeways. The advance slowed but did not stop. German reports from mid-February describe enemy continuing offensive operations despite unsuitable terrain. The Weasel, officially the M29 Weasel, was a tracked cargo carrier originally designed for snow. It floated, barely. It could carry 250 kilograms of supplies. The Canadians used them to shuttle ammunition across flooded fields to forward positions. The DUKW, an amphibious truck, carried larger loads but couldn't navigate the forest tracks. So supplies came by DUKW to the forest edge, transferred to Weasels, then moved forward. Slow, inefficient. But it worked. On February 19, the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division entered Muschow, a fortified village east of Cleve. The Germans had flooded the approaches and mined every road. The only way in was a single causeway. The 84th Infantry Division expected the Canadians to attempt a frontal assault. Instead, the Canadians used crocodile flamethrower tanks, Churchill tanks with flame projectors. The crocodiles moved down the causeway, sprayed liquid fire into the German positions, and suppressed the defenses long enough for infantry to cross. Muschow fell in 6 hours. The crocodile's flame projector had a range of 110 meters. The fuel mixture, a gasoline-based gel, stuck to surfaces and burned through bunker ventilation slits. The psychological effect was immediate. German infantry withdrew from positions hit by flame. The Canadians didn't need to clear every bunker. They just needed the Germans to stop firing long enough for infantry to cross the causeway. The German after-action report notes, unexpected use of flame weapons in coordinated assault. The Fallschirmjäger had faced flamethrowers before, but not in this concentration, not with infantry-tank engineer coordination at this level. By February 21, the 1st Canadian Army had advanced 15 kilometers. The Reichswald was cleared, Cleve was taken, Goch was under assault. Schlemm's orders to his divisions were now simple: withdraw in good order. Do not allow encirclement. The assumption that the Canadians would fold under pressure had been tested. It failed, but the cost was real. The 2nd Canadian Infantry Division suffered 2,300 casualties. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division lost 1,800 men. The Fallschirmjäger fought hard. They did not collapse. They withdrew when ordered, but they withdrew because the Canadians kept moving. Here's what the German intelligence summaries missed. The Canadian operational doctrine was not cautious. It was deliberate. There is a difference. Cautious armies stop when casualties rise. Deliberate armies continue when the plan allows it. The Canadian Fire Plan, logistics network, and infantry-tank integration allowed continuous pressure. The artillery never stopped. The engineers kept the roads open. The infantry advanced in bounds, short, controlled movements, but those bounds did not stop. The Fallschirmjäger expected the Canadians to act like other Commonwealth forces they had faced in Italy, methodical, yes, but vulnerable to disruption. The Canadians in the Reichswald were methodical, but they were not disrupted. Their system worked. On March 10, 1945, Operation Veritable officially ended. The 1st Canadian Army and XXX British Corps had reached the Rhine. German forces had withdrawn across the river. The Siegfried Line's northern sector was broken. The operation achieved its objectives. The cost was high: 15,634 Allied casualties, approximately 22,000 German casualties, with estimates ranging as high as 38,000 when prisoners are included. The Reichswald forest, once considered a defensible killing ground, was now a graveyard. German post-war interrogations include statements from officers of the 7th Fallschirmjäger Division. One report, filed by U.S. Ponte, interrogators in May 1945, quotes an unnamed Fallschirmjäger major. "We expected the Canadians to fight like the British at Caen, slowly, with pauses for reorganization. They did not. Their artillery was continuous. Their infantry did not stop. We could not predict their movements." That's the operational lesson. The Germans assumed the Canadians would behave according to a pattern observed earlier in the war. The Canadians did not. Their doctrine had evolved. Their artillery was better coordinated. Their engineers were integrated into the assault plan. Their infantry-tank teams trained together. The logistics network functioned under fire. None of this was heroic. It was procedural. The Canadians did not charge into machine gun fire. They suppressed the machine guns, flanked them, or burned them out. They did not advance recklessly. They advanced when the fire plan allowed it. They did not ignore casualties. They evacuated wounded under fire and kept moving. The Germans thought the Canadians would fold. They were wrong. Not because the Canadians were braver, not because the Germans were weak, but because the operational system the Canadians used in February 1945 did not match the one the Germans expected. War is a test of assumptions. The Reichswald tested both sides. The Fallschirmjäger held longer than expected. The Canadians advanced despite conditions that should have stopped them. The outcome was determined by logistics, coordination, and the ability to continue under pressure. The battle is not widely remembered. It does not have a dramatic name. It was not a turning point, but it was a demonstration. The 1st Canadian Army demonstrated that late-war Commonwealth forces could sustain offensive operations in the worst possible conditions. The Germans demonstrated that even in retreat, Fallschirmjäger divisions could inflict severe casualties. Both sides were correct. Both sides paid the price. The difference was that the Canadians kept moving, and in February 1945, that was enough.